Hey everybody. So today I wanted to take a minute to talk about the map Hamburger. Um, Hamburger is a map that is officially in the definitive edition. What we're looking at here is not the definitive edition version. It's a bit of a more simplified version, which is going to make it a bit more easy for us to see what's going on. But basically, the way the map works is that players are on an island, so to speak. They are separated from the outside terrain by this little channel of water. And there's only one single solitary wood line that's in a line between the two players. So let's go into the code of the map and see what's going on and how this map is being made. So we'll start with the land generation section. So effectively, we start out creating the two-player lands separated by team and having some other zone avoidance distance, with the borders on the map constituting how far the player lands are going to be spawning away from the edges of the map. And then in the terrain generation section, we turn everything to water. And then at the end of the terrain generation section, we are left with this point here. So as we can see from this point, the fact that we are looking at this and every little bit of this channel here is covered in water and not woods, we have to see later on that the woods are being put back in the connection section. So basically how that works is there's a player land here and a player land here somewhere, and the game is basically going to draw a line between those 2 points and replace all the water with forest terrain. So we are replacing all of the water in the middle with jungle. And basically that's how the map is created. Now, connections are not typically something that I personally use to create really critical land features on a map. In this case, it really doesn't make such a big deal. I mean, we can keep on generating. We can see the map looks consistent enough. But I've seen it happen before. There are rare circumstances, I'll bring up this image here, where connections can actually lead to some problems. See, this is a screenshot from the official Hamburger map in DE, where the connections method of creating that forest in the middle is actually creating quite a bit of a problem, where instead of just replacing the water in the middle, it's also replacing the water on the side with the forest, and it's really screwing up the way the map is intended to be played. And all this kind of got me thinking whether there might be a more consistent way to achieve the same kind of effect on a map. So that's what we'll be going through today. So over here in the test script, we have what is an exact copy of the map we were just looking at. And so we're going to be working with this to see what changes we can make. So we can generate the test script and see that we're basically starting from the same spot. So first thing I'm going to do, since our goal is to make the forest without having the connection section, we'll get rid of the connection section here. And then we'll start at the very top of the map with the land generation section. And so this is the way the original map has it. What I'm going to do is get rid of that intermediate step of starting out with Palm Desert and just start out with water. And then here we have what we're going to be starting with. And then in the terrain generation section, we're no longer going to need to create water on top of Palm Desert. But this next step of creating grass, which is 9 tiles away from the player lands on top of the water, is still going to be important. So here we still have this. Now, at this point, if I wanted to start thinking about making a forest that I want to be in the middle here, we can consider that I wanted to put it on top of the water and avoid this outer terrain, which is grass 3. So if I tried doing something like that, I wanted to create some jungle terrain. that's going to be on water, and I want it to stay away from the outer terrain, which is grass 3. I can say spacing to other terrain types 15 or so, so it will stay 15 tiles away from the grass. But, as we should know by now, spacing to other terrain types means spacing to all other terrain types. So, since we're trying to put it on water, it should also avoid this player land terrain, which is grass 2, and stay 15 tiles away from that. So essentially, there should be essentially no room to put that forest. And that's basically what we're seeing here. Now, if the player lands were something other than grass 2, if the player lands were water, for example, if the player lands were made of water, we would potentially see some forest here that stays 15 tiles away from the grass 2 on the outside. But obviously that is a bit counterproductive in our case because we need to still know where the player lands are and where that zone separation is. So we would need some sort of other distinguishing feature about the player lands to distinguish where the borders are and where the zone separation needs to be. And to do that, I'm going to use a base elevation. And we must make sure that we have an elevation generation section in the map if we're going to include that. So if we ignore the terrains for now, let's just see what we have for our lands. So now we can see that because we added that base elevation, that the lands look like this. And then we can add that outer terrain back in, like that. And now let's see that if we cover up the player lands with water, we should still be able to distinguish where those are because of that elevation. So even though the terrain is all homogeneous, we can still identify where the player lands are supposed to be because of that elevation difference. And now if we wanted to put that jungle back in, we can do that. And instead of taking up all of the area, we can put height limits on this. So we can say take up all of the area that's 15 tiles away from the outside that occupies elevations 0, 0. And now we can see that we now have achieved a tiny strip that's between where the players are supposed to go. And now, if we want to bring back the player lands, all we'd have to do is cover up the water with the grass 2 that used to be there at elevations 1, 1. So we'll create grass 2 on top of water at height limits 1, 1. So we can see what we have here, and we can uncomment the rest of the script, which is going to be essentially the same. And we can see we have a map. We've achieved something where we can have the central wood line in the middle, but it came at the expense of having to elevate the player lands. Now, this elevation of the player lands may have a bit more serious consequences than we might initially think. So even though all of this is supposed to be at 1, 1, there's still this tiny strip of water that's still elevated on the side, so that it would actually fundamentally change the way that water fights would play out. Because if we have a water unit up here and a water unit down here, there's actually a hill bonus involved with that, which actually is going to fundamentally change the way the water works on this map. So we are going to have to think of a way to get around this. So what we'll do is that instead of having the base terrain as water, we're going to replace that with something else. So instead of the base terrain of the map being water, we're going to make the base terrain of the map dirt 2, and then respectively everything in the beginning of the terrain generation section that was referenced to water will also be dirt 2. So when we do that, we can see, of course, that the water on our map has now been changed into dirt 2. So in order to make sure that the water is only appearing on flat terrain, what we can do at this point is, where do I want to insert this, is right over here. So this is the point where we can start bringing the water back in. So if we create water on top of dirt 2, take up all the area, and say spacing to other terrain types is 1. So since we are creating a water terrain on top of a ground terrain, the water must avoid elevated tiles by that amount. So we can see here that the water is a bit thinner because we have that avoidance, but it will always appear now only on the flat terrain, so that the water fight will play out relatively the same way. So since we took away 2 tiles, 1 tile on one side and 1 tile on the other, we will add 2 to this initial separation to make the water about as thick as it was normally. So that basically does that. And now if we bring back the rest of the map, we can see what we have here. We have eliminated the issue of having the last tile of the water elevated above the rest of the water. So now the water fight on this map is going to be playing out pretty much the same way as it would normally. The only difference is the player lands are now a bit elevated compared to the water. So if people wanted to play tower defense for the water, that would be a bit more effective, but I think that's a sacrifice I'm willing to make in order to achieve a more consistent map with something like this. Now, one other thing I wanted to mention is that if we go back to the original version, that this wood line is slightly more condensed towards the middle and also slightly thicker. And that's because when we're dealing with the connection section on this map, we have an avoidance distance of 4, but the connection section also replaces the beach. So we have 4 tiles of water plus 1 tile of beach on each side. And since we're not including that in our version, which is in the test map, the wood line is slightly thinner. So what we can do in our test map is, where we have our other zone avoidance distance of 4, we'll increase that to say 7, so now the wood line will be a bit thicker. And then if we want to condense it more towards the middle, so it's not as wide, we can always increase this avoidance distance. We have it as 15 away from the outside. If we wanted to make it 20, it could be that far away from the outside. It could be 25, which makes it even a bit even more condensed. Could make it even as high as 30. So we have it very thin. Now, obviously, since we use this technique of elevating the player lands, the map that we have now is never going to perfectly resemble the original version. But that being said, the method that we used is still worth considering because it gives us quite a degree of consistency that we always now have our wood line in the middle, and we can be confident that we're never going to be running into a situation where we would be replacing terrains that we did not intend to replace if we had used a connection method instead. So that's just one of the ways where we can achieve a solution to an issue by thinking a bit outside of the box. And I think that's a bit about all I wanted to talk about in this video. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.